When we ponder the advances in industry, technology, and medical science, especially over the past 100 years, it's hard not to stand in awe of how far we have come and to consider how far we have progressed as a civilization in many ways that previous generations could not even understand. In reference to medicine, we now have so many different drugs and procedures to deal with problems that we have been unable to deal with in the past. Now there are some diseases that have been completely eradicated and others can now finally be treated. In fact, there are many issues, there are those who haven't been able to walk, now through certain procedures can walk. And there are those who have difficulty hearing or cannot hear at all that can now hear. And it's fair to say that, of course, we have not arrived. Many of our procedures have negative effects, and many of our medicines still have negative side effects as well. But I still would prefer to live now than versus 100 or 200 years ago. And hopefully, things will continue to progress. And hopefully, in the future, much of the technology will be so developed, and our understanding will be so developed that much of what we do today will seem barbaric. But of course, with all our new technology and discoveries, it's only natural that we would try and overcome one of humanity's oldest obstacles, and that is the obstacle of infertility. This has been a problem for countless generations. In fact, we read of couples in the Bible who struggle with this very problem. And when we read passages like Genesis chapter 30 and we read of Rachel and her struggle with infertility, it's hard not to feel her stress and her sadness and grief. What does she tell Jacob? Give me children or I will die. We also find in 1 Samuel chapter 1, and it's hard not to be touched as Hannah prays through her tears over her struggle with infertility. And this is something that modern couples struggle with. One source indicates that 19% of couples are unable to get pregnant in their first year of trying. And those who struggle to get pregnant often experience a great deal of grief and discouragement. After all, when we consider Genesis chapter 1, we see that this is one of the first blessings given to humanity. And it is always sad when one is unable to enjoy it. Now, and it is only natural that medical professionals would try to help couples overcome this issue. However, when it comes to dealing with medical technology and our ability to assist in the creation of human life in new ways, we should not only ask, what can we do, but also what should we do? I'm reminded of a quote from Jurassic Park from the character Dr. Ian Malcolm when they're debating the consequences of cloning. And he says, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they did not stop to think as to whether they should. And of course, as we are progressing in our technology and what we can do, that should always be a question. Of course, we should ask what can we do, but we should also ask what should we do? And in reference to this particular topic, I want us to explore two different kinds of procedures or strategies for dealing with fertility, and that is in vitro fertilization and surrogacy. Now, technically, the question that was asked tonight was about surrogacy, whether Christians could become surrogates or utilize a surrogate to have a child. And of course, that's an important question. But one only can become a surrogate through in vitro fertilization. And as we'll see, there are actually more ethical challenges to that process versus the surrogacy itself. So we have to explore both if we want to consider whether or not a Christian can participate in such procedures. Now, before we actually get to talking about these things, let's go ahead and explore important principles in reference to life and death. And this will help us, this will become our framework for determining whether certain aspects of this are right or wrong. One of the first things we need to emphasize is that human life is intrinsically valuable and sacred. As we see in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, God says that He created man in His image. He created both male and female in His image. As we also see in Psalm 8, verses 3 through 8, we find from the very beginning that God cares deeply about humanity and has given humanity a place of privilege and supremacy in his universe. We also find that not only is human life intrinsically valuable and sacred, but in reference to the taking of life, God has sole dominion. He says in Deuteronomy 32:39, "See now that I, even I, am he, and there is no God beside me. I kill and I make alive." Now you may ask, well, aren't we talking about the creation of life? And we are, but as we'll see, there is actually quite a bit of death that is common with these processes. Now, even though he has invited us into the process of making human life through reproduction, we see that he has only given us the permission to take human life in certain scenarios. As we see in Genesis chapter 9, verses 4 through 5, we see that there is an obligation for humanity to ensure a justice system, that if someone kills someone in cold blood, that justice is executed and their life is taken. We also find in passages like Deuteronomy 20 that there is a principle for taking life in the context of a just war. If there is a nation state invading you, you have a responsibility to protect your people, even if that comes at the cost of killing the enemy combatants that have invaded or intending to invade. We also not only need to consider that human life is intrinsically valuable and God has the sole dominion over taking it, we also need to consider when life begins. When the scriptures were written, humanity did not yet have the tools to understand the process of making life on a micro level. Nevertheless, the inspired writers did acknowledge that this process was of and from God. As we see in Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16, the psalmist says this, for you, God, formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, for my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance, and in your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, and when yet there was none of them. Now one might say, well, isn't it humans that create human life? And that's true, but it's God who initiated the process and designed the process. Therefore, he is still credited with the creation of human life. Now, through our advancements, we are now able to observe that both men and women contribute to human life by providing different components, a sperm and an egg. However, we should note that the sperm and the egg by themselves are merely components, just like, for example, sugar, flour, eggs, milk, butter, and vanilla are all individual ingredients themselves. Only when they come together do they make a cake. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, isn't that very obvious? I think it is obvious, but when it comes to the creation of human life, many people unfortunately try to throw out principles of logic and the concept of identity when dealing with conception because they want to push a particular political agenda. We acknowledge that the sperm and the egg by themselves are simply products of individual humans. But once a sperm fertilizes the egg, it becomes a human. This embryo becomes a human because it becomes a life form that is both separate and unique from the father and the mother. And it's at this point that it has all the genetic components it needs, and it has its own DNA unique to itself, separate from its father and mother. And I believe the principles that we find in Scripture, principles we find from logic and science, can help us confidently conclude that this newly formed life form is human and is therefore entitled to human rights. One, we know it is human. It's not a cat. It's not a dog. It's not an elephant. We know and we can observe that it is a human life, and it is alive, or else it would not be growing or developing. And because it is human, and because it is made in the image of God, and because God has determined its value and purpose, its life must be respected. Some trying to muddy the waters in reference to its value and humanity. Some will say, well, we really can't consider it human until it's the second or third trimester. But this is actually a form of discrimination called ageism, where someone is discriminated against because of their age. After all, we don't apply this standard of humanity in any other context. If you were to take an adult male who is 18 years old, who is a legal adult, he is still in the process of developing. His brain will not be developed fully until he is 25 or 26 years old. And yet we still give him the same level of humanity as anyone else. And if you want a simple quote from the philosopher Dr. Seuss, he says, "A human is a human, no matter how small." Very simple principle, but I think it is so true. Some try to make arguments about the status of it being in the womb, saying that, we really can't consider this a life or a human until it is outside the womb. But one's humanity is not determined by their location. For example, if I'm here, or in the ocean, or on the moon, or in China, it does not change my humanity. This is what we would call geographical discrimination. A human is a human no matter where they are. So we, as well as many other students of the Bible, would acknowledge that human life begins at conception, and this is very important for our discussion tonight. So let's explore now in vitro fertilization. There may be a couple that will struggle to have children naturally, and they may consider using in vitro, and they may also take another step considering surrogacy as well. But let's consider surrogacy, and we'll begin by just doing a general overview of the process. The first step is that fertility medications are prescribed to the woman to stimulate egg production. Multiple eggs are desired because some eggs will not develop or fertilize after retrieval. Eggs are retrieved through a minor surgical procedure, and then in step 3, the male is asked to produce a sample of sperm, which is prepared for combining with the eggs. Step 4, in a process called insemination, the sperm and eggs are mixed together and in a laboratory dish to encourage fertilization. The eggs are monitored to confirm that fertilization and that cell division is taking place. Once this occurs, the fertilized eggs are considered embryos. The 5th step is that the embryos are usually transferred into the woman's uterus 3 to 5 days following the egg retrieval and fertilization. If the process is successful, implantation typically occurs around 6 to 10 days after following egg retrieval. Now, initially, this brief summarization doesn't sound bad. It doesn't sound like there's any ethical conundrums here. After all, what does it matter if a life is conceived in a dish and then immediately put into the mother versus being conceived in a uterus? It seems to be a matter of location. However, there are many aspects of this process that are commonly practiced that clearly go against the Christian ethic. For one, a husband may not be able to produce healthy sperm, or a woman may not be able to produce a healthy egg, and so they might utilize a donor. This raises serious questions, and some have even asked, is this adultery by proxy? After all, if a woman creates a child with another man outside the marriage, is that technically adultery? And maybe it is. Although even if we were to say, well, it's not adultery because there's no sexual activity, this still raises another serious question, and the idea of a parental obligation. As we see all throughout the scriptures, it is always assumed that it is the father and mother of the child who would be tasked with raising and building up that child. And we find many passages in Scripture. I will just list a few. We find in reference to fathers, we can see in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24, and Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, that fathers are expected to be tasked with raising and contributing up to the molding of their children. We also find these same principles for mothers in Titus 2, 4 through 5, and Proverbs 31, 10 through 31. And I can't conceptualize how God would approve of a man or woman contributing to the creation of a child only for it to be sold to another couple. In any other context in society, this would be seen as very dishonorable. After all, if a man creates a child with a woman and then walks out on her, we consider that very dishonorable, even if another man steps up to help raise the child. And in reference to this facet of in vitro, it seems to create a situation in where parents become the parents of children, but play no part into their lives. However, if a married couple wishes to use their own sperm and egg, I can't personally see how that facet of it would conflict with Scripture. So this is an option, and I do think it is an unethical option, but it is an option that does not have to be used. Now, another important facet of in vitro fertilization that needs to be explored is the discarding of embryos, of eggs that are already fertilized and human. Some parents may be predisposed to particular genetic disorders, and they may decide that they don't want to pass on such a genetic disorder. And so they can use a process called pre-implantation genetic testing, where they might take, let's say, 10 eggs that are fertilized, 10 little humans, and they might cause them to undergo a test. And any to which they find this anomaly will be discarded, and the healthy ones they will keep. Of course, we can already imagine the ethical implications of this. After all, if you found out your child had a deformity or some kind of just genetic disorder, you would not discard him or her or throw him away. And yet, unfortunately, this is a process that many pursue. And unfortunately, we find this even in reference to later in pregnancy. There are a lot of couples that will do a genetic screening for their unborn child, and if it has any genetic anomalies, they can choose to abort it. There's another difficult aspect of this process, and it is, and to demonstrate, let me show you this example. Once multiple eggs are collected, let's say about 10, and they are fertilized, let's say 10 eggs are collected, typically only about 7 will be fertilized, and of those fertilized eggs, 3 or 4 will be discarded. But why? Well, the clinic will monitor the growth of each fertilized egg to see if they are progressing. And by day 6, the embryo should enter the blastocyst phase with 200 to 300 forms of cell division. For example, when an egg is fertilized, it begins as a single-cell organism, then divides into 2, and then 4, and then the process continues. And by 6, there should be 2 to 300 forms of cell division. And if they do not make it to that point, they are discarded. Now, I did try to find a little bit more information on this. I did call a few fertility clinics. They were too busy to deal with the particular question. I wish I could have found more information on this, and this is something you're considering. I would recommend you looking into this a little bit further, because if these embryos are discarded just because they haven't reached a particular stage of development, they're essentially killing these little humans just because they didn't make it to the right point. Even if we had a child that for whatever reason stopped developing, we would not simply discard them. We would ensure that they had the best life possible. So that's something to consider. Now, often when it comes to in vitro fertilization, more embryos are created than they would intend to implant in the uterus. But the question is, if you have all these little humans, what do you do with the rest that are not intending to be implanted? Well, some choose to discard them. They may say, well, I don't need them now, and so they are simply thrown away. Some couples may choose to discard the embryos of one particular sex. For example, if there is a couple that wants to have a boy or a girl, they might test all the embryos, and if they want a boy, they might get rid of all the girls. If they want a girl, they might get rid of all the boys. And this is essentially choosing to kill their own children because they had the wrong gender. Some might choose to donate them to another couple, but again, they are giving away their responsibilities to their own child to another couple. Some might donate them to a research facility. But again, would you give away your own child to be a lab rat in a test facility? I can't imagine doing that to my 2-year-old or my 1-year-old, and I couldn't imagine doing that to an embryo that was but a few days old. Another thing to consider is that a couple may not want to discard their embryos, but they may freeze them instead. And this creates other ethical problems. For one, not all embryos will survive the freezing and thawing process. And so you have this problem where you're bringing these little humans into the world, and then you are subjecting them to another risk by freezing them. But there's another problem, and this is a difficult problem that perhaps humanity has never had to deal with. Is it right to suspend a human in stasis for long periods of time? Now, hypothetically, we might develop the technology where we could even freeze an adult human being. We may say, well, if there's a terrible car accident or a serious issue and they're going to get medical treatment soon, we might say, well, let's freeze this person, let's suspend them in stasis for a short period of time, and they get the medical help that they need. But when it comes to freezing embryos, this is something that can be done for years at a time. Last year, in 2022, the Ridgway couple decided to adopt 2 embryos that had been frozen since April 22nd, 1992. They are technically 31 years old this year, but physically speaking, they're only about a year because they have been suspended in stasis for 3 decades. Now, something about this might feel wrong to you, and it may be difficult to kind of put your finger on what is wrong with this picture, but think about it this way. Would it be fair for someone to induce you into a state for 3 decades, only for you to re-enter the world a generation behind where you're supposed to be? And is this what God had in mind when He commissioned us to be fruitful and multiply, to take our children and to set them aside, maybe even forget about them for decades at a time? I think we can clearly see the implications of such a choice. So we should ask, should Christians use in vitro? Now, I think we can conclude that there are a lot of facets of this that can be abused and show a lack of respect for human life and dignity. However, as we've pointed out, nearly all, if not all of these facets are optional. They don't have to happen. And let's say that a Christian couple determined to use this process, but they were going to avoid all these negative effects. What if a Christian couple simply wanted to use their own sperm and egg and wanted to do this in the most ethical way process, and they would ensure each embryo would be treated with respect and would not be discarded for any reason? I think that might be a context in where it could be considered. However, I'm going to ask you some difficult questions where I'm not sure there's an easy black and white answer, but it is something that a Christian couple would have to consider if they are going to pursue this process. Regardless, on average, even if it's done in a very ethical way, this process often results in a lot of death, even if it's unintended. Let's say you fertilize 10 human eggs, you create 10 human beings. Odds are they are all going to die. From what information I have gathered, about half of them will not develop. And whatever embryos are implanted, odds are they are not going to make it to birth. If you are a woman under 35, the highest chance to end your first IVF cycle, the odds of actually ending in a live birth, are only 43%, and not even 50%. So if this is a process you initiate, there is a significant chance that the majority, if not all the humans that you create, will die. And so one might reasonably ask the question, is it good for Christians to initiate a process where most of their children will die? Although there's another side of the coin. For one, when it comes to conception, there is always a risk that that child will die. According to one source, there is about 10 to 20% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. And some have actually suggested that it is far more than that. It is likely that many women conceive a child, but because it dies so quickly, they do not even notice. So regardless, there is a risk at the loss of life, even through natural means. Of course, it is increased through in vitro fertilization. And of course, there are certain women and certain couples that because of some biological issues, most of the children they will conceive will die anyway. I know one particular couple where they did bring 2 children to birth. However, they had about at least 10 other miscarriages and probably more that cannot even be counted because of the physical issue that they had. And of course, I don't think any one of us would say that that's wrong to try and bring life into the world. One may even ask, well, is it better to create life, to give it a chance at entering in this world through birth than not giving it a chance at all? And so these are questions that if a Christian is considering this process, this is something that they will have to wrestle with. And if a Christian couple was considering this process, they would have to make sure they did a lot of research on the clinic they were working with. There was one very religious couple that chose in vitro fertilization, but they were not familiar with the process. And they ended up creating 29 embryos, 29 little humans. And before they even realized that the clinic had already discarded 7 of them. And now they are tasked with the responsibility, because they understand the value of life, of trying to bring each of these embryos into the world over a long process. And I know one preacher in particular who studied the subject, and he suggested that, it might be advisable to, if you're going to try this process, maybe only get 1 egg, maybe only try to fertilize 1 egg. The odds aren't in your favor of it actually coming to term, but we do know at least that 1 life will be respected, and there will not be these extra that will be frozen or discarded. And some have, and this particular couple, they suggested after their experience that you should only perhaps try fertilizing as many as you are ready to bring to term, which makes the process more expensive for your odds. So is in vitro right or wrong? Well, conceptually, theoretically, the process does not seem wrong if it is done in the most ethical way. There are many ways in which it can be wrong and abused. And in fact, I think it is reasonable for some couples to say there's just so much death involved that they would not want any hand in it. But I'm not sure there can be a sharp line to say it is wrong in every context if it is done in an ethical way. But there are certainly many ways in which it can be done in a way where life is not respected. Now let's talk about the question of surrogacy. What is surrogacy? Surrogacy is an arrangement in which a woman, the surrogate, agrees to carry the child of another couple to term on behalf of the other couple, the intended parents. Now the question is, can Christians become surrogates, and can they even utilize a surrogate in their attempt to bring life into the world? Now, of course, we're essentially exploring this question separate from in vitro fertilization. Let's say hypothetically there is a way to utilize it in the most ethical way possible, and this person becomes a surrogate. We're dealing with that question in that context. Now, let us first consider maybe the most ideal way in which a woman could become a surrogate, and then talk about some ways in which it could be done in a way that God would not approve. Let's consider, hypothetically, a married couple who wish to use their own sperm and egg, and for whatever health reason, another woman's womb, because perhaps the wife's womb is not hospitable for an embryo. And let's say they seek out a woman that they know maybe at church or a relative, and they ask her to carry the child to term. Is this within the Christian ethic? I think so. The child is created in a God-ordained union where they are committed to raising the child as God intended. The only complication is that the child must be sustained in another woman's womb for 9 months. While I don't think this facet is ideal, and I don't think most do, I don't see how that would be inherently wrong. After all, hypothetically, let's say for whatever reason, you had a health issue in your life that prevented you from taking care of your child for a period of 9 months, and you entrusted a friend or a family member to do so. I don't think any of us would bat an eye or see that as unethical. And also consider the practice of wet nurses. For thousands of years, there have been women who have been unable to provide enough milk to sustain their infant. And so they have used another woman in the village or the city to provide breast milk for their child, to use their own biological processes to sustain the life of the child. Now, I'm not saying this is identical to surrogacy, but we do find this same principle of a woman using what she possesses biologically to sustain the life of a child. Again, I'm not saying this is ideal, but if a couple wishes to fulfill the mission and blessing that God has given them, and this is the only way they can do it, I can't see how this particularly would conflict with the Christian ethic. But there is a cost. There is an emotional and physical cost. For one, the mother of the child will not have the opportunity to build that same unique bond she would if she was carrying the child. The child's not going to grow accustomed to hearing its mother's heartbeat or growing accustomed to hearing its mother's voice or its father's voice. And there is a severe emotional and physical cost on the surrogate herself. And of course, many women who have had children know how difficult it is having a child for one you get to keep. It becomes even more difficult knowing that this child will go to someone else. And we all know the cost having a child takes on your body. And knowing that it often comes with a risk of developing a heart condition. And of course, the anticipation of dealing with the postpartum issues that come after. These costs and these issues cannot be ignored or overstated. And some who are familiar with this process have even suggested if they are to do it, they should do this with a friend or a family member or someone that they know closely. However, I think we can confidently conclude that surrogacy in and of itself is not wrong, but there are many ways in which it can be wrong. For example, there may be a single man or woman, and there are single men and women, who would hire a woman to be a surrogate, or they might even ask a friend to be a surrogate. What we find in the scriptures is that God always intended for children to be raised by both parents, by both a father and a mother. And even research studies have shown that children are raised most optimally in this kind of environment. And of course, if this is initiated by a single man or a woman, they would have to use a donor for an egg or a sperm, and we already talked about the ethical issues with that. And of course, this should not be something that is encouraged for same-sex couples. As we see in Romans chapter 1, verses 26 through 27, that this is not a union that God approves of. And it also either robs a child of either being raised with a father or robs a child of being raised with a father or a mother. So in reference to the question of surrogacy, there doesn't seem to be any biblical concern if it is done in the right context. But it is the process of in vitro fertilization that raises more ethical questions. And if this is something that you are considering, I would recommend don't just take what I've said. Do much more research and do a lot more research on the clinic that you would consider using. And if this is a process that you would consider, you would have to make sure that life is respected and that it cannot be treated with any kind of casualness or flippancy. And I would also not recommend going to any kind of clinic that does treat life in a very casual way. Unfortunately, there are a lot of fertility clinics that casually dispense with the life of humans every single day, and I can't imagine how God would bless their hands in this process. But there is something else to consider. As we talked about earlier, there are couples now who are adopting embryos, and they are giving this embryo a chance at life that they have been robbed for so long. And if you are a Christian couple and you are thinking about adopting, this might be the way to do it. Unfortunately, there have been so many children that have been frozen, that have been suspended in stasis. And if you want to go through the process of developing this intimate relationship with this child and carrying it for 9 months, this is one of the best ways to do it. And as we see according to James chapter 1, verse 27, this is a way in which you can demonstrate godly and true religion. Now, before we conclude tonight, if there's anyone here who needs the prayers of the congregation, if you are here and maybe there's something on your heart or there's a concern you have in your life, we'd love to pray for you and go to God on your behalf. Or if you're here today and you're not a Christian, but you now believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you're willing to repent of your sins, confess his lordship, and put Christ on in baptism, that is so we can assist you now. Or if there's anything at all we can do for you spiritually, please come forward as we stand and sing.